Hi, I'm Noam Wasserman, Dean of the SciSim School of Business at Yeshiva University. I was a longtime professor at Harvard Business School, an entrepreneur, and a venture capitalist. I wrote the bestseller, The Founder's Dilemmas.
And I'm Charlie Harari. I've been working with companies for over 10 years. And that book, The Founder's Dilemmas, and the challenges faced by the 10,000 founders in it is the basis of this podcast. We are delving into the issues faced by startups to help you avoid the pitfalls that claim so many good companies.
Let's get started.
Okay, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Founders Dilemmas podcast. It's been a pleasure with all these episodes we've had until now, and we've got a great episode coming up. And of course, I am with the one and only Dean Wasserman. Dean, what do we got this week?
Hey, great to be back with you, Charlie. And today we have another star entrepreneur, a star serial entrepreneur, with whom I go back a while and have seen the ups and downs, mostly ups, of all the things that he's experienced, and we'll hopefully be able to learn from both the highs and the lows. Eli Portnoy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I really appreciate you having me on.
It's our pleasure. And let me give a little bit of the background, a little bit of the career path, and then we'll leap into the two major domains that we'll be tackling, but I'm sure things will come up from across the entire rest of the life cycle of founding. Eli, I first met when he walked onto campus at Harvard Business School as a student. I soon came to know that a bit of his background was some real entrepreneurial background. And so an opening question that we will have is about why should an entrepreneur get an MBA? Why does an entrepreneur need any kind of schooling? Why don't you just dive in and do it? Especially you had taken a dive in and had done it, so why come back for doing it? But then at HBS, we'll also talk a little bit about my first ever conversation with you to set that table. When you then graduated, you went and worked for the biggest of companies. You worked for Amazon. Then you left Amazon, and this is some of the classic of the early story for you. You resigned from Amazon after graduating from HBS in 2009. So you stuck around Amazon a little bit. You resigned in January 2011. And you resigned to become part of the TechStars incubator and found what became Think Near. And then barely more than a year and a half later, you exited, as in had the biggest sale in the history of TechStars, one of the most important of the startup incubators or incubator networks, sold it to Telenav for $22.5 million after just a year and a half worth of work. And so what we can learn from that rocket ship that you're able to grow, and then since then have had multiple other ones, why you keep re-upping and heading back into the founding pool is another one of the things that we'll hopefully cover. But in general, the two ends of the founding journey are what I think are the things that we want to focus on the most. So first, in terms of the early stages, we'll get into some of the career decisions to become an entrepreneur and be able to set the table for yourself. But also, how do you get an idea? How do you vet an idea? How do you get the early days in place for it? And then we will skate to the end of the process about the acquisition, about preparing for sale, and other things along the way there. And so that's just to give a little bit of the roadmap of what we're going to be heading into. So without further ado, let's talk a drip about our first ever conversation was when you signed up for my Founders Dilemmas course. And I was asking Eli, why would you waste one of your 10 scarce electives on something that you've already learned? You've been an entrepreneur. You are the last one who should be taking Founders Dilemmas. Let me back up from that conversation to earlier than that. You'd been an entrepreneur after college, and then you still decided to go and get an MBA. Why go back to school to begin with?
Yeah, it's that was one of the really hard decisions for me because I started a company called Hire Workers, and we had some early success. We were able to build a product that worked. We were able to acquire and retain customers, and it felt like things were going well. And what I've learned through that experience was that building a business really, or a startup really has two components. There's the product, and then there's the business around it. And I felt like I had done a good job on the product side, but had really not done a good job on the business fundamentals. I didn't know how to set up the accounting frameworks. I didn't know how to think about the financing the business. I didn't really know how to think about the operations. There were just a lot of things that I missed and ultimately made it much, much harder for the business to succeed, even if we had a good product. And so as I thought about how to round myself further and how to get ready for the next venture, it felt to me like I really needed to get a foundational education in some of these other parts of running a business outside of just product.
Okay, very interesting in terms of that realization. Was there a particular event that led to, Ellie, I'm an incomplete entrepreneur because I haven't been able to tool up and get that foundation built?
Yeah, absolutely. So very early on in that venture, we were approached by a company about an acquisition. And we started to have the conversations. And anytime we would talk about the product, I felt very comfortable. Like I understood what we were trying to do and where we were going and how they would think about it. But when we would talk about the rest of the business, I just didn't have a good handle on it. I didn't really understand the economics and the margins. I didn't have my financials in a good place. And it made it really hard to go through that process with them. But it also made me realize it was going to be very hard to scale beyond this little product that I had built, because I wouldn't be able to raise financing. I'd have a hard time like building the infrastructure around it. So but it was those key moments around that acquisition conversation that made me just realize how little I knew about building a company outside of just the product, which I do think you can learn by doing.
Do you find that's typical? You know, in the real estate world, we call it deal guys and org guys. I find that, you know, guys that sometimes run organizations more than I would say this is the norm are deal guys. They just know how to put together deals, and they've been successful at amassing the business, the service, the product that their company exists within. And either they, and I'm asking, is it that they're not good at it? They don't care about it? That's not what their skill set is? Are the org guys, because they don't have a product, never the guys in charge? Like, I find that what you're saying is pervasive throughout the entire industry at all levels.
Yeah, I do find that I see it a lot. So I've had a chance to meet a lot of different entrepreneurs and see how they build their businesses. And it strikes me that building a company does have those two components. And the very earliest stage, it really is about the product. So you have a lot of people who are good at building products that don't really understand the mechanics of the business. And so they get to a point where like they've got a real, like a product that is turning into a business, and they very much struggle with that transition. And the great ones are able to figure out how to transition. Some of them can do it through advisors, through people that they hire, through lots of different means. I just found it really hard to think about starting another company and hitting that wall and needing to rely on other people to break through it. And so it felt like getting that education up front would make me able to then build a business and scale it. But almost everyone I see like hits it at some point and just deals with it in different ways. But there's a lot of it. That's why you see a lot of companies like bring in like the adult supervision, like the Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook. And there's just so many classic examples, because you have product people who don't know how to build businesses. And at some point they just need to.
Right.
And by building that foundation, you could extend possibly dramatically your horizon for being able to continue being able to lead the charge and not have to be part of the hazard of succession that we've covered definitely during season 1 and several other times during this.
For sure. And that's such a critical point, because I have found that the best CEOs of companies, not just products of companies, tend to be product people. It's the people that like understood the pain point so deeply that they built the right product for it. And it's a real shame when that product person scales out of being able to be the CEO anymore, because the company loses when they're not the CEO. And so it's a secret power to be able to understand the product, but also have enough of an understanding of the business that you can stay on as the CEO and still lead the company once it emerges beyond that product phase.
Okay, there's 2 other observations that, and then I would definitely throw it to you, Charlie. First off, this is very wedded to your aspirations. If you are just aspiring to have a small company, not to have something that is going to have scaling as a part of the design, not having the larger entity as being something that you're hoping to be able to lead eventually, that changes the equation. You might not need to build the same foundation. You might not need to go back to school, be able to make sure that you're armed for being able to have that larger aspiration be met. The other one is that acquirers aren't looking for a disposable entity. They're not looking for something that isn't built to scale. They want something that once they acquire it is going to return value to them and is going to be able to scale. And so if your aspiration is also to be able to exit eventually, they're looking for something that's been built well, that has this thought out in terms of the operations, in terms of the team. The robustness is built in, and the scalability is something they're going to be able to assume.
Yeah, one of the points that you made, I think, is so spot on, which is acquirers really do look to acquire businesses, not so much products. And across both our acquisitions, the fact that our financials were in a good place, the fact that our operations were in a good place, the fact that it was plug and play and there wasn't a ton of cleanup that needed to happen, made us a much more viable candidate and created a lot of opportunities for us. So there's just a lot of benefits to understanding how to build a business beyond building a product.
Do you find that, especially at the startup stage, the better way to do it is through partnerships? Like I'm thinking through what you're saying, and you're 100% correct. And Dean, what you're saying as well, which is businesses buy things that can scale, and a product that just makes sense, but they can't really plug it anywhere or do anything with it is less valuable. I'm just wondering if the entrepreneurs that start companies really have a knack for the product and have a sort of like a special interest and have developed a little bit of a unique skill that lends itself to building a product that can stand out in a market. And I wonder if in the beginning or as a company matures, if by just shifting and getting involved in finance or operations or org design or all the stuff that you need to run a company, it's going to either distract them, they play with their left hand, and it takes them away from perfecting or really creating a product that matters?
It's a really, really good question. And I don't know the right answer. My point of view is that I was never trying to get a business school education so that I could become the COO or the CFO. I was trying to get the business school education so that I understood the components so that I could integrate them into the product and also think about the decisions that those departments were making and how they affected the product and vice versa. And so that I could hire people to actually do it. I felt very uncomfortable hiring a CFO if I didn't really understand how to think about a P&L. And so yep. I think you're right. I think you still want the CEO to be focused on like the vision and the mission and the product and all the things that like drive the most value. But at least I found that if I didn't have at least a solid base for the other pieces, it was really hard for me to even get to the point where those became issues.
Right. I just want to make sure for those that are listening that this is super clear, because this is great advice, which is a lot of times when you look at a company and you go to the C-suite, you find people that are niched into what they know and know nothing about what they don't know. And so the CFO walks in and shows them numbers and they're like, yeah, whatever. And then they move on to drawing on the whiteboard, right? Or the COO walks in and is explaining to them the logistics and they're like, I that's why I hired you. And they lose. And I think what you're saying is critical for those that are listening, which is, you don't have to be the COO to have enough information to be able to be a valuable partner to the COO. If for no other reason to spot incompetence. Like how many companies, I'm sure you've seen this, I've seen this, where the CFO is less competent than people think, but the CEO doesn't know that because he can't even spot competence. So they start struggling with the banks and all the stuff that's going on. And the CEO finds out one day that he just has no idea, where just being able to say, I need to know enough to be conversant, to be able to be valuable. I don't need to become the CFO. I think that balance is critical. And I don't think people are aware of it as much as one would think. I think they should take that advice.
I hope so. It's definitely been very helpful for me and getting that sort of like seasoning around some of these other things that I don't do on a day-to-day has been invaluable.
Yeah, so there's two levels to the way you're talking about there, Charlie. There's the CEO being familiar enough with all the different functions that they can be able to work effectively at hiring and then being able to work with that person. But the critical person is going to be having to knit together across all the functions. And so as Eli was saying before, being able to see business as a system, being able to see how when you push on this side, that part is going to be affected, and then being able to be that integrator across it. In some ways, similar to being a dean. I have my 5 department chairs. Each of them knows really well what's going on in the departments. I rely on them to have the curriculum in top shape and their faculty in top shape, but one doesn't know how much is going on in the other departments that are going to be affecting them. And so my being able to integrate across them and being able to play that kind of role, in addition to understanding enough about the 5 departments that I can be able to be effective as the knitting across them. That's the key part of what you have to be able to do as a leader within a startup.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start heading into now the idea side of it, how to get a venture off the ground. In general, Ellie, finding an idea for a startup seems to be a random process. Waiting for lightning to strike, having the light bulb go off seems like something you can't really program, that you can't really predict or anything like that. Can you develop, and have you developed, a repeatable framework to find new ideas and to find good opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really great question. I've always wanted to have that light bulb moment when I'm in the shower and this like fully formed idea hits me and I just go and build it, and we build a great company. Unfortunately, I've never had that. It has never been like this one eureka moment. It's always been a very like long iterative process of evolution where it starts with some insight and it turns into a business through just a lot of conversations, discovery, understanding of the problem. And the reason I think it works that way for me is because I tend to focus on B2B opportunities, basically a problem that a business is facing rather than a consumer. And most of the time, I don't know the business landscape at an in-depth enough detail to understand like the true nuances of the problem and how to build a solution. So the framework that I developed was to try to find the spaces that are most suited for building a business. And to me, there's a few things that I look for. So the first is it's got to be a really, really big market, because at least in my experience, building a small business and building a big business are both equally as hard. So you might as well go into a big market. Mm-hmm. The second thing I look for is a space that's changing very rapidly, that has a ton of volatility, because the more volatility the space has, the harder it is for the incumbents to play in that space and to keep up. And when I think about the advantages that a startup has, it's focus, it's speed, and it's agility. And when I think about all the disadvantages it has compared to a big company, there are tons: resources, manpower, access, distribution, brand. And so the only way to win is to put yourself in a position where the cards are stacked in your favor, and volatility stacks them in the favor of a startup, where it becomes more about speed than distribution, agility versus resources. And so I look for big space that are undergoing massive volatility. And then I just plant a flag. I just come up with whatever idea I can come up with, knowing that it's probably not a great idea, but it becomes an excuse to then start reaching out to people in that space and talking to them about the idea. And people are really good about giving feedback. And if you just listen and hear and like try different things, the idea just starts to iterate and evolve and move. And eventually you get to a place where there's a real business problem in a space that's changing, where the incumbents are having a hard time maneuvering, and where you have a lot of insight and can build something. And this is the framework I've used across the 4 businesses that I've founded. And I find it works really well. And it's uncomfortable because you have to be willing to start when you don't have the perfect idea. And it's also uncomfortable to have to constantly be iterating and changing. But I think it's the best way, or at least for me, it has been.
I love this. This is gold. And I think whoever's listening should send you a check when they're done building their business, because you laid it out in a very clear, concise way, some really important principles. And if I can, I want to delve on one, because each one was great and we can talk about each one. I love the idea that you've identified volatility, because volatility, it's scary to be an entrepreneur. It's scary to be an entrepreneur in a volatile world. And it's intuitive to not do that. Like, I would think the intuitive way of thinking is you find something that is more dependable, that you can understand, that operates in a certain normalcy, because there's so much abnormalcy in an entrepreneur's life. But what you just brought out, which I think is great, is no. That's your benefit. I think people don't appreciate how hard it is for an incumbent to do anything different, and how big companies they can't turn, it's the Titanic. There's so many people that are working in so many desks. that are doing the same thing yesterday. To move a company is so complex that if you're in a volatile world, you have this incredible advantage because you're on a small boat versus you're on a big ship. I love it. And I think that it gives a counterintuitive way of looking at something, that you have to override the system. But if you do, you have incredible advantage.
Thank you. Yeah, it's volatility is fun. Definitely something to look for.
Right. If you
And
have the
so,
stomach for
Ellie,
it.
I was going to push you on taking one of your exits as an example to be able to flesh this out for. But actually, I think it'd be more interesting with what you're going through right now.
Yeah.
So if you could take us inside the current hunt, you just have wrapped a ribbon around one of the past ones. Right now, you're grappling exactly with this. So take us right now inside your thinking. Where are you seeing the volatility that's going to be your friend? How are you going to take it from there in terms of the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the caveat around this is that this is still very much in play. So it's going to continue to evolve. But the basic idea is, when I look at the world today, I see one of the biggest volatility forces I've ever seen in my life. And that's the emergence of large language models, generative AI, basically the advancements in artificial intelligence. And you could see how it's changing almost every business in some pretty dramatic ways. And if you look at like what webinars are being hosted now, it's all about like generative AI in this sector and in this industry and how you should use it. People are really grappling with how is it going to change all these tools that we're all using. And so when I started to think about, okay, how can these new technologies automate business processes? That was like sort of the big market with a lot of volatility happening. And the first inclination of a business idea came from my brother-in-law, who's an accountant, who was telling me how hard it is to hire other accountants and how he needs to start automating some of his business. And so I just spent some time talking to him, learning, speaking to other accountants, auditors, just basically trying to understand what does their workflow look like and what are the pieces that LLMs could potentially automate. And the deeper I got into that conversation, the more I realized that there were some very clear consistencies in the pain points that they were suffering and what other businesses and other verticals and other categories were also suffering. And it became very clear to me that what was really happening is that there's this like swivel chair issue where so many people in these businesses are basically going into one system, grabbing a piece of information, turning around, putting it into another system. And they're acting as like a human pipe between disparate systems. And so I started to think, okay, well, that seems like a commonality. How can I build a tool that helps automate that using these LLMs? And then as we started to go through that, we started to realize actually the power is deeper than just grabbing information and putting it somewhere. You can actually create some very complex logic and judgment that you can do as a system when you grab that information and before you put it in. And so we started building these workflow automation systems that are just like built from the ground up with LLMs. And so that's kind of where we are. I'm sure it'll keep evolving, but that's kind of like the sequence that we've been going through.
Okay. No, one of the other things that I love about your encapsulating things, and also two things that this highlights. This is a radically different domain than what you've done in the past. And so where the ideas and where you take them, they are a lot of times the variety of the ideas is pretty different across your ventures. The other one is your ability to encapsulate the problem in a phrase. Here, it's the swivel chair problem, being able to, as soon as you say that, people can see themselves in it. They can relate to the problem, and then they're begging for, Ellie, what is your answer to it? And the other ways that you've been able to do that throughout the other ventures, being able to have that encapsulation is oftentimes a magical step that you can take on the way to that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And by the way, Dean Wasserman, I very vividly remember some of the data you showed me where repeat entrepreneurs have more success when they go back to domains they're comfortable with. And so that is something that I've actually struggled with quite a bit with this business, because there's a lot of, a network and a series of like learnings and lessons that I've learned in other industries. And so that's one of the dangers of having a very iterative process, is it could just take you in random places and you can lose some of the core strengths that you have, but we'll see how that plays out.
I have a question that maybe we can answer on the next podcast, and maybe we'll just leave our listeners with this, which is really, it goes back to the first piece, which is, it sounds to me that you began as a product guy, but you're really now an org guy, meaning you're really saying, wait, forget the problem, forget the product. I have a framework of how to solve things and how to find problems, solve them. It feels operational. It feels that the strategy has moved from I'm good at something, let me build it, to I'm agnostic to the thing that I'm building. I am now going to take a very well thought out frame and place it into a space that is big and volatile, and it can be iterated. And this thing that you have is an algorithm, if you will, that you can apply to creating new businesses, which is really product agnostic.
Yeah, and I might even take it a little further and say it might even be helpful that I'm coming into these industries with no prior knowledge, because there's no baggage around how things were done, and every question I ask ends up being like very simplistic and at its core. So yeah, I do think this process really helps and doesn't require, it actually does better when you don't have a lot of prior knowledge around the space and the market.
So let's do this. For those who are listening right now, we are at episode 1 with Eli Portnoy, and we will come back for another episode. So stick with us. This is Charlie Ari and Dean Wasserman for Founders Dilemmas Podcast. You can always email us at foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com, and we will see you next time.